Hi, welcome or welcome back. My name is Eleanor, and I'm starting this new year, 2025, with more poetry. Now, there's lots of different reasons why people read poetry. There are many reasons why I read poetry, but at the moment where I am, I'm looking for poetry that will satisfy my need for going further into the mystery of language and the mystery of the silences around language. So, after the ephemeral qualities of life and death as they are captured by poets. This might change. I might next week want something else for my poetry. I might be sick of it. I change my mind, as if you've been playing along, as you probably know already. But at the moment, I have this great desire for this kind of poetry. Now, some people find that that sort of poetry is inaccessible. And my point for myself, I'm not here to teach. I'm no teacher. I'm just trying to find what makes me happy. And I'm not trying to persuade you of anything. I have nothing invested in this other than my own enjoyment. What I'm trying to do is somehow try to reach, although it's impossible, the inaccessible aspects of life, the aspects of life that are beyond language. And I feel that that can only be done using the vehicle of poetry. So while many people might point a finger and say, this poem is inaccessible, to me it is actually a vehicle allowing me access to that something else. So I hope that satisfies your curiosity if you're wondering why I have been harping on about this for a while, I think. Well, a few months anyway, while I've been on BookTube. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I discovered a new to me poet, Jean Valentine. She's a huge name in the American poetry world, and I was advised by a teacher a few years back that I might enjoy her. And I could never make head or tail of her, and I've just left her book on my shelf. And lo and behold, I was reading a book last week. I have a video about it. It's a book by Brenda Hillman about poetry, and she mentions Jean Valentine. And suddenly I thought, maybe I should give Jean Valentine another go. And I did, and I was enraptured. Since then, I've been reading a lot of her poems and reading a lot about her poems. And so I thought I'd better quickly do a video about that. Now, to talk about Jean Valentine's poetry is very difficult. I mean, as far as her biography goes, I think she was born in the 1930s. I will check that. 1934, and she died at the age of 86 in 2022. So she has a lot of books out, and it is overwhelming if you get the new and collected works that came out a couple of years after her death. It can be overwhelming. I would recommend that if you're interested in checking her out, you go to her website, links below. I will link to the specific page on her website, which has a list of a variety of her poems and links to them. You can read them and listen to them. And that might give you an idea if you want to look further. Her latest book was A Shirt in Heaven. And let me just check, that came out in 2015. So I would recommend that if you do sort of like her poems from the website and you're interested in looking further, you might be able to, well, especially if you live in America, you might be able to find her book Shirt in Heaven in the library or for relatively cheap. In any case, what I'm reading is the latest new and collected. I decided to download it onto my e-reader, and I'm finding that even though up until this moment, I've preferred to read poetry in book form, I'm forcing myself to get used to it on the e-reader because it is, first of all, very cumbersome to be dragging around large collected works if you have them. But apart from that, the e-reader has two things that really sell it for me with poetry. The first is that you can immediately see definitions of words, the dictionary definition, and poets love to use unusual, often will use words that are unusual, and that excites me, and I want to look it up immediately, and that's very easy. The other great pro about the e-reader is that you can do a search of a word or, a phrase. So if there's a particular word that is being repeated throughout a book of poems, you can immediately see in what poems it shows up, and that's something that you can never get from a paper book, which I think is interesting to note. Apart from that, of course, it's obvious that the real downside of the e-reader is that you're going to have to often make the font minuscule so as to make sure that you don't sacrifice the proper lineation. Because when you get a paper book, the lines are as the poet wanted, but that can vary with the e-reader. I haven't found that too much of an issue. But that's a tangent. So going back to Jean Valentine, she was born in Chicago, spent most of her time in New York, and she was actually state poet of New York. She won, I think, every award available through her many creative years. She was, from what I can read about her, an amazing teacher who was very encouraging and a great inspiration to many younger poets. She taught at Sarah Lawrence, NYU, Columbia. She writes in a way that feels almost dreamlike. She writes as if she's making new associations that haven't been made before, making up her own mythology and I use that in a very loose way. I think that I wanted to quote Adrienne Rich because she's actually quoted on Jean Valentine's website, and I thought, well, Adrienne Rich is going to get it much better than me, and it's such an excellent quote. She says, looking into a Jean Valentine poem is like looking into a lake. You can see your own outline and the shapes of the upper world reflected among rocks, underwater life, glint of lost bottles, drifted leaves. The known and familiar become one with the mysterious and the half-wild at the place where consciousness and the subliminal meet. Consciousness and the subliminal meet. This is a poetry of the highest order because it lets us into spaces and meanings we couldn't approach in any other way. And that's exactly what I was trying to explain at the very beginning of this video as to what my main aim is at the moment, what sort of poetry I'm interested in and what I'm looking for. And while it didn't work for me 3 years ago, it's now something that I really desperately need in my life. And so I thought I'd mention it here. Now, if this doesn't make sense to you, if you're sitting at home and you're thinking, Eleanor, that doesn't actually make sense. Like you're using poetry as a vehicle to access something that's inaccessible. Rest assured, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, and that's the point. It's beyond language. So as far as, let me check where I'm at. Okay, so as far as what's happening now with how I'm going about reading her is I've got her collected works and I'm dipping in and out. But that can be really overstimulating, and it's a deluge of language. And with her, you really have to read very slowly. Her poems force you to slow down. So if you're looking for that in the new year, that's another thing. You can sit with one of her poems for a while. There's no rush. And it's going to be a kind of, if you're sitting and reading her, you're doing something that isn't really booktube friendly in a way, because you can't really say, I read this book by this person and this is what I thought. You're slowly getting used to and slowly immersing yourself in her world, and it'll probably be something that's quite personal. You might, I'm guessing, but if your reading is similar to mine, then you might feel at some point that you can't get in, and then all of a sudden you feel and think something, and you doubt yourself, and you say to yourself, is this in the text, or have I just daydreamed it? And so because I was asking this question of myself, I went to read secondary sources. Not everyone likes to do that, but at the moment when I'm reading something that is intriguing to me, I really yearn for a community of other very serious readers, and that's thankfully available often, just because there are academics who write about certain poets. And so I went looking, and I found the most fabulous book, so what I'm doing is I'm spending some time on my own reading some poems depending on my mood and the time of day or night, and then I'm going back and forth, because I've got everything on my e-reader, to this mammoth, amazing book of essays. It's about 25 essays, I think, and each essay is an incredibly helpful, detailed discussion of an aspect of Jean Valentine's poetry. So you can pick and choose what you're in the mood for. Now, one of those essays happens to be by Brenda Hillman, who is now my new love, if you've been playing along. So I'm very much enjoying that. And I will say, I often spend money on books, and afterwards I feel, gosh, I wish I hadn't. I wish I'd waited till the library had it, or I wish I'd borrowed it from a friend. But I actually feel like with this book of essays, it's well worth. It's a little bit more expensive than a regular book on an e-reader, and it's not a current book. I think it was, when did it come out? It came out in 2012, but it's so helpful, and for me fun, because it's fun to read what others think, and when those others are actually professional poets or professional poet educators, or poetry readers, intellectuals, it's incredibly, it's wonderfully exciting and stimulating for me. So that's what I've been doing. There's also a book by C.D. Wright. C.D. Wright writes quite a bit about Jean Valentine in this book in very unusual ways. So she chooses to, because Jean Valentine's poetry is so difficult to get to really define, C.D. Wright chose to describe it in a similar way, and I really, really appreciate that. So what I'm going to be doing is, I imagine that I will discuss all of that more in my next video. So there are going to be several installments, and I can't tell ahead of time what's going to happen, because it just depends on my mood and what I discover. A couple of things I discovered when I was thinking, I was researching how best to present Valentine here on BookTube, and I came across a couple of videos. One is Franny Choi, who is a poet, a published poet herself, and has also been on a podcast. I first found out about her from a podcast, which she's not on anymore, I don't think. And she explains why she likes one of Jean Valentine's poems, and she reads it. And I really like what she says and how she reads. And the second one I came across was Kaveh Akbar, which I find really interesting for many different reasons, but I thought it might be helpful to put here, to link to him here, because he also talks about how he's affected, deeply affected by the writings of Valentine, and he also reads one of her poems that's dear to him. And I thought, because I know on BookTube a lot of people have read his novel, which is his first novel, called Martyr, I thought that might be a good way, if you're looking for a way to almost trick yourself into poetry. Like sometimes you want to be interested in something, but you can't quite, get the lock unlocked. Maybe Kaveh Akbar will do that. He is extremely charismatic, and he's also a very generous teacher. So there's that. Now, finally, just before I started taping this, I was watching Sophie at Bibliosophie, and she mentioned how she wants to, but doubts that she'll be able to because it's a huge project, have a record of all the allusions in every book that she reads to other books. So every time a book alludes to another book or another writer, she'll make a note of it. And that immediately reminded me of something that happened while I was reading Jean Valentine. And I thought I'd mention it here, because it's I think extraordinary how often in the poetry world this happens, that you'll read one poet and they will write a poem for another poet or in memory of another poet, or they'll mention another poet in the notes, and so you can sort of hop, skip, and jump, and that way, because it's the poetry crone and I don't know her first name, but she's also another booktuber. In her comments and my comments, we have been discussing between the two of us, how difficult it is to actually find poets. They almost seem to not want to be found. And the ability one has with prose to go into a bookstore and be able to browse freely amongst many, many shelves is something that poetry lovers don't have. Now, it's no use boohooing and crying over it. It's just the way the commercial life works in a bookstore. But you might have 4 or 5 shelves if you're lucky, but you're not really going to be able to have that browsing factor. So to be able to find a poet in the work of another poet, as Bibliosophie was saying, is a great treat. And what happened with Valentine for me is that she had a poem that was dedicated to Tomas Tranströmer. And I'd heard his name. He's a Swedish poet who is translated into English. I'd heard about him, but never really paid attention, never read. And I thought, well, if she's writing to him, I better look him up. And that opened an incredible treasure chest, because I now find that Tomas Tranströmer is another poet that I love. So I'm sure I will be bringing him in probably in the next video, but definitely after that as well. So I think I'm going to finish there, because if you have any interest in this and you go, as I think it's best to, rather than forking out money, go to Jean Valentine's really good website, to that page where you can read a variety of her poems. then maybe when I start talking about specific poems that are my favorites and what I think of them and what other people are saying about them, maybe I can meet you in a bit of a level playing field, in the sense that I can have the curiosity of thinking, oh, I wonder what, this viewer of this viewer would have thought of this poem or that poem. And you too can have that curiosity. Oh, I wonder what Eleanor will be talking. I wonder what will be, Eleanor's poem that she'll enjoy, and what she'll be talking about. So I'll leave you there, and also remind you that the only real property is the property of the mind. I've had some issues, unfortunately, with my eyes. I have a condition that flares up, so please excuse me if I look a bit odd sometimes. And I'm very excited about this new direction my poetry reading is taking. And it's really serendipity. I jump from one thing to the next like an excited schoolgirl. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.